The rifle steel is cold, but the air around the firing line is suffocating. Imagine standing before a group of elite operators who have already decided you're a failure. They see a paperwork officer, someone who belongs in a cubicle, not behind a long gun. But as her finger settles on the trigger, they don't see the ink on her skin or the ghosts of a valley in the Hindu Kush. The question is, can a single shot rewrite a reputation? Or is the weight of the past too heavy to carry? The sun didn't just rise over the high alpine ranges of the Iron Peaks. It cut through the frigid morning air like a serrated blade, casting long, skeletal shadows across the firing lanes of the Black Ridge Training Complex. The atmosphere here doesn't just feel cold. It feels heavy, saturated with the metallic tang of spent brass and the low-frequency hum of high-performance engines idling in the distance. In this world, reputation is the only currency that matters. And for Captain Elara Vance, the account was supposedly empty. To the men prepping their long-range systems, Elara was a ghost in the machine, a paperwork officer. They saw the straight spine of an administrator, the analytical eyes of someone who spent her life staring at logistics grids and ammunition manifests. They didn't see a shooter. They saw a bureaucrat in a flight suit, someone who handled coordinates on a map but would crumble under the raw, violent recoil of a .338 Lapua. Think about the weight of that silence. Every time she walked past the barracks or the briefing rooms, the air would shift, not with respect, but with a casual, dismissive indifference. It's the kind of isolation that eats at a person's sense of self. What would you do if your entire professional existence was reduced to a punchline before you even opened your mouth? Master Sergeant Kalin stood at the center of the range, a man whose presence was as jagged as the peaks surrounding them. His voice didn't just carry, it dominated, a gravelly bark that had broken more soldiers than the terrain ever could. He prided himself on his predator's eye, the ability to look at a soldier and know, within seconds, if they had the steel to survive the first hard contact. When Elara approached the line, Kalin didn't even look up from his dope chart. He just sensed the admin energy approaching. The gravel crunched under her boots, a steady, rhythmic sound that lacked the frantic hurry of a novice. She stopped 3 paces from him. The air between them grew thick, the kind of pressure that precedes a lightning strike. "Master Sergeant," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange, flat clarity that cut through the wind. "I'm requesting a slot on the Tier 1 qualification lane." A ripple of movement went through the gathered soldiers. It started as a smirk on a corporal's face, then grew into a sharp, staccato burst of laughter that rolled down the range. It was careless, cruel, the kind of laughter used by people who are absolutely certain they are superior. Kalin finally looked at her. His eyes were narrowed against the glare, searching her face for a flinch, a tremor, any sign that this was a joke or a momentary lapse in judgment. He saw nothing. Elara stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her breathing so shallow it barely moved the fabric of her uniform. "The Tier 1 lane is for shooters, Captain," Kalin said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "It's for the people who live in the dirt and breathe cordite. It's not for people who clear grid confusion from a heated office." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, trying to use his physical mass to force a retreat. The men behind him leaned in, whispering, their voices dripping with a confidence they hadn't earned. They mocked her analytical eyes, calling her a tourist. They bet against her before she even touched a weapon, their words floating like toxic smoke in the crisp morning air. But look closely at her hands. While the men laughed, Elara's fingers didn't twitch. Her gaze didn't dart to the ground in shame. She let the disrespect wash over her like the mountain dust, refusing to give their mockery a shape or a reaction. She was choosing control over ego, silence over foolishness. Imagine the psychological pressure of that moment. You are one woman standing against a culture of elite arrogance, being told you don't belong in the very arena you've spent your life preparing for. Would you have turned around? Would you have let the insult be the final word? Kalen leaned in further, his shadow completely engulfing her. You're wasting the cadre's time, Vance, and in this unit, wasting time is the fastest way to make enemies. Take the hint. Go back to the admin shack before you get someone hurt, starting with yourself. The order was meant to be a door slamming shut. It was a final, public humiliation designed to send her packing. The soldier started to turn away, the entertainment seemingly over, already losing interest in the officer who dared to dream of the long gun. Elara didn't move. She didn't blink. Just give me one lane, she repeated. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was absolute. The wind itself seemed to pause, as if the mountains were leaning in to hear the answer. Kalen's jaw tightened, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson as he realized his authority was being challenged by someone he considered a non-combatant. He looked at the firing bench, then back at her, a predatory grin spreading across his face, the kind of look a cat gives a mouse before the end. Fine, Captain, Kalen hissed, his voice brittle. You want the lane? You got it. But we don't do practice rounds here. You miss the first plate, you're off my range for good. No appeals, no second chances. And I'll make sure your evaluation reflects exactly how much of our time you wasted today. He gestured toward the matte, black rifle resting on the bench, its optics glinting like a cold eye in the sun. The crowd formed a semicircle, arms crossed, waiting for the inevitable failure. Elara stepped past him. Her boots hit the gravel with a quiet finality. As she reached for the rifle, the sleeve of her blouse shifted just enough to reveal a sliver of dark ink on her forearm, a series of numbers and crosshairs that didn't look like art. They looked like a record. Kalen reached out, his hand hovering inches from her wrist to stop her, his face twisting with a sudden, unexplainable flicker of doubt. Wait, he barked, his voice cracking the silence. What is that on your arm? The range froze. Not a single soldier laughed. The question from Master Sergeant Kalen hung in the air, heavy and jagged, like a piece of shrapnel. Elara didn't pull her arm away. She didn't offer an explanation. Instead, she slowly finished rolling her sleeve, exposing the ink fully to the harsh, unforgiving light of the iron peaks. It wasn't a decorative piece of art. It was a grid of numbers, tiny and precise, etched alongside a stylized set of crosshairs. To the uninitiated, it looked like random data. But to a long-distance shooter, it was a dope chart, a permanent record of atmospheric corrections for specific extreme distances. What would you do if you saw a ghost from your past written in ink on a stranger's skin? In the back of the crowd, Sergeant Jax, a veteran who had spent more time in the sand than in the States, felt the hair on his neck stand up. He had seen markings like that before, but only in places the government officially says we aren't. The markings weren't just numbers. They were trophies of survival. He watched as Elara's breathing began to change. It wasn't the shallow, frantic rhythm of a nervous officer anymore. It was deep, rhythmic, and mechanical. She was entering a headspace that most soldiers never find, the cold, empty valley of the professional hunter. Kalen's grip on his own clipboard tightened until the plastic groaned. He felt a sudden, cold prickle of sweat down his spine. The admin energy he had mocked was gone, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the range had lost its oxygen. "The rifle, Master Sergeant," Elara said. It wasn't a request this time. It was a directive. Kalen stepped back, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel, the sound amplified by the sudden, suffocating silence of the men. Elara didn't rush. She moved to the shooting mat with a fluid, economical grace that bypassed conscious thought. It was muscle memory, deep, ancient, and undeniable. She settled into the prone position. Her elbows didn't fumble for placement. They locked into the dirt like anchors. Her spine aligned perfectly behind the bore of the rifle, creating a straight line of recoil management that you only see in people who have fired thousands of rounds under duress. Think about the physical toll of a long gun. The weight of the chassis, the bite of the cheek weld, the way the heartbeat vibrates through the optic. Most beginners fight the rifle. Elara seemed to become part of it. The wind shifted. It was a fishtail wind, coming off the ridges in unpredictable 10-mile-per-hour gusts that would toss a bullet like a leaf. The men watched her, their smirks now frozen into masks of uncertainty. They expected her to ask for the wind reading. They expected her to fumble with the turrets on the scope. Instead, she closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. She wasn't praying. She was feeling the air on her skin, listening to the flap of the range flags, and calculating the mirage boiling off the dirt. When her eyes opened, they were fixed on the glass. Her hand moved to the elevation turret. 3 clicks. Then the windage. 2 clicks left. No hesitation, no second-guessing. Jax leaned forward, his own knuckles turning white as he gripped his vest. He recognized that ritual. It was the quiet, internal dialogue of a seasoned long gunner reading the atmosphere through instinct rather than instruments. He noticed something else. A thin, pale surgical scar just above her wrist, a mark from an injury treated far from any modern hospital. The moral weight of the moment began to shift. The men who had laughed minutes ago now looked at each other with shifting eyes and shallow breaths. They weren't just watching a qualification. They were witnessing a lie unraveling. The story they had told themselves, that she was weak, that she was just a paperwork officer, was dying with every second she spent behind that rifle. Elara's finger entered the trigger guard. It didn't jerk. It didn't pull. It settled on the metal with the lightness of a dragonfly. "Target is at 800 yards, Kalen called out, his voice cracking, desperate to reassert some form of control. "Center mass, or you're done." Elara didn't acknowledge him. She was already gone. In her mind, the world had narrowed down to a single point of impact, a tiny circle of steel nearly half a mile away. She waited for the natural respiratory pause, the moment between breaths when the body is most still. The shot broke. The crack of the rifle echoed off the surrounding peaks, a sharp, violent thunderclap that made the younger soldiers flinch. A plume of dust kicked up from the bipod as the rifle pushed back into her shoulder. Elara didn't lift her head. She stayed on the gun, watching through the optic to track the trace of the bullet. A second later, a distant, metallic clang drifted back across the range. Impact. Dead center. The silence that followed was different than before. It wasn't dismissive. It was haunted. The soldiers looked at the 800-yard plate, then back at the small-framed woman who had just made the shot look like a routine chore. "Beginner's luck," someone muttered from the back, but the voice was thin, lacking any real conviction. Elara didn't celebrate. She didn't look back for approval. She reached out, cycled the bolt with a crisp metallic clack-clack, and chambered the next round. She adjusted her cheek weld by a fraction of a millimeter, her eyes never leaving the glass. Kalen's face was no longer red with anger. It was pale. He saw the way she handled the bolt, the way she didn't even have to look at the chamber. He saw the absolute lack of tremor in her hands. He realized he hadn't just invited a pencil pusher onto his range. He had invited something he didn't understand. 1,200 yards, Kalen whispered, his voice almost lost to the wind. "The silhouette. Do it again." That was the distance where the luck ended and the physics began. At 1,200 yards, the bullet would be falling through the air like a stone, affected by the Earth's rotation and the cooling temperature of the mountain shadows. Elara adjusted her stance, her right foot pressing into the dirt to stabilize her weight. She didn't look at Kalen. She looked through the scope, past the target, and into a memory that no one on that range was cleared to hear. She took a slow breath, her chest rising and falling in a perfect, mechanical cycle. But as she prepared to squeeze the trigger, the wind didn't just gust. It roared, a sudden, violent change in direction that would send any normal shot feet off target. Jax watched her finger. It stayed frozen on the trigger. He expected her to wait for the wind to die down. Instead, Elara did something that made Jax's heart stop. She didn't wait. She reached up and dialed a correction into the scope that seemed completely insane for the conditions. It was a correction for a wind that hadn't even reached her position yet. "She's not reading the range," Jax whispered to himself, his eyes wide with a terrifying realization. "She's reading the valley." Elara fired. The 200-yard shot is where math ends and the black art begins. At that distance, you aren't just aiming at a target, you are aiming at a ghost. The bullet stays in the air for nearly 2 seconds, long enough for the wind to change its mind 3 times, long enough for the gravity of the earth to pull the lead in a heavy, lethal arc. Think about the silence of a range when the stakes shift from mockery to disbelief. It's not a peaceful quiet, it's a vacuum. The air felt thin, stripped of its warmth by the towering peaks of the iron ridges. Sergeant Jax watched Elara's trigger finger. It wasn't moving. It was part of the machine. He noticed her pulse, not in her face, but in the slight, rhythmic tremor of the rifle's suppressor. She was timed to her own heartbeat, waiting for the exact millisecond of stillness between blood and bone. The second shot broke. The sound didn't just pop. It rolled through the valley like a mountain collapsing. For 2 long, agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the whistle of the wind through the pines. Then, a faint, crystalline ting echoed back from the gray haze of the far ridge. It was the sound of steel being struck dead center by a projectile moving faster than sound. The range didn't cheer. They didn't even breathe. The soldiers stood paralyzed, their cross-armed stances beginning to fail. You could see it in their eyes, the rapid-fire recalibration of everything they thought they knew. How does a pencil pusher handle a cold-bore shot at 1,200 yards in a fishtail wind? The logic of the group was shattering, leaving behind a cold, uncomfortable realization. Kalen's hand was shaking as he gripped his binoculars. His knuckles were white, his breathing coming in short, ragged bursts that clouded the air in front of him. He wasn't just losing a bet, he was losing the foundation of his authority. He had built his reputation on being the ultimate arbiter of who was a warrior and who was a guest. Now he was looking at a woman who hadn't just met his standard, she had humiliated it. "Luck," Kalen hissed, though the word felt heavy and false in his mouth. "Pure statistical luck. You guessed the wind, Vance. You got lucky on the drift." What would you do in her position? Would you take the win and walk away? Or would you keep pushing until the truth was undeniable? Elara didn't look up. She reached for the bolt, her movements as cold and mechanical as the rifle itself. Clack, clack. Another round chambered. The sound of the brass hitting the gravel was the only thing breaking the tension. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply shifted her gaze toward the observation hut, where the shadows were deepest. "I don't guess," she said, her voice a low, flat rasp. The wind in this valley always breaks left at the 300-meter mark because of the granite shelf. If you spent less time talking and more time listening to the air, you'd know that, Master Sergeant. The insult was quiet, but it hit harder than the bullet. Jax felt a chill that had nothing to do with the alpine frost. He realized she wasn't just shooting. She was dissecting the terrain. She knew the geography of this place better than the men who had been stationed here for years. Suddenly, the heavy steel door of the observation hut groaned open. The sound was like a gunshot in the stillness. A tall, imposing figure stepped out into the harsh sunlight, his 4-star rank glinting on his shoulders. General Thorne. The entire range snapped to attention, boots clicking against the rock, spine straightening in a wave of conditioned reflex. Thorn didn't return the salute immediately. His eyes were fixed on Elara, who remained prone behind the rifle, her eyes still locked on the glass. She was the only person on the range who didn't move. Thorn walked slowly down the line, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He stopped directly behind Elara. The air around him smelled of old leather and cold coffee. He didn't look at the targets. He looked at the ink on her forearm, the permanent record of numbers she had tried to hide beneath her sleeve. "I haven't seen a dope chart etched like that since the siege of the Black Pass," Thorn said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the aggression Kalen had used, replaced by something much more terrifying: recognition. The men in the semicircle exchanged glances of pure confusion. The siege of the Black Pass was a classified legend, a ghost engagement, where a small team of unregistered specialists held off an entire division. It was a story told in shadows, a story that didn't involve admin officers. Thorn leaned down, his eyes narrowing as he read the numbers on Elara's skin. "That wind correction for the 1,200-yard plate. You didn't calculate that today, did you, Captain?" Elara slowly took her hand off the trigger and looked up. For the first time, the mask of the pencil pusher slipped. Her eyes weren't just analytical. They were haunted by the weight of 1,000 miles and 100 choices she couldn't take back. "No, sir," she replied. "I calculated that correction 3 years ago, in a valley that looked exactly like this one." The general's face went stone cold. He turned his gaze toward Kalen, who was standing as still as a statue, his face drained of all color. The master sergeant looked like a man who had just realized he'd been mocking a lion while standing inside its cage. "Master Sergeant," Thorn said, the words dripping with a quiet, lethal disappointment. "You told me this officer was a liability. You told me she was a paperwork error that needed to be flushed out of the system." Kalen tried to speak, but his throat was dry, his words catching like thorns. He looked at Elara, then at the general, his world tilting on its axis. Thorn turned back to Elara, reaching out and pointing to a specific mark on her wrist, a small, jagged tattoo of a broken arrow beneath the numbers. "Show them, Captain. Show them why you don't need a spotter." Elara hesitated. "Think about the cost of revealing a secret you've used to protect your peace. Once the world knows who you are, you can never go back to being a ghost." She slowly stood up, the rifle slung over her shoulder. She gripped the hem of her sleeve and pulled it all the way up to the shoulder, revealing not just more numbers, but a massive, intricate tapestry of scars and ink that spanned her entire arm. The range went dead silent as they saw the mark at the very top, the seal of the Shadow Cadre, a unit that officially does not exist. "My God," Jax whispered, his voice trembling. "Captain Vance isn't here to qualify," Thorn said, his voice echoing off the peaks. "She's here because I've been looking for the only survivor of the Black Pass for 2 years. And you, Kalen, just made the mistake of trying to break the most lethal asset this military has ever produced." The soldiers didn't just look at Elara differently. They looked at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. But the general wasn't done. He stepped closer to Elara, his expression turning grave. "But there's a problem, Elara," Thorn whispered, so only she could hear. "The people who tried to kill you at the pass? They know you're alive now, and they're already on their way to this range. The revelation of the Shadow Cadre seal didn't just change the mood at Black Ridge, it inverted the gravity of the entire mountain. The air seemed to grow colder, more crystalline, as the reality of General Thorn's words settled into the marrow of every man present. Think about the sheer, crushing weight of that realization. These men had spent the morning trying to break a woman who had already been through a hell they couldn't even define. Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone and realized you weren't looking at a peer, but at a survivor of something that should have been impossible? Elara lowered her sleeve, but the image remained burned into the retinas of the soldiers. The intricate ink, the scorecard of engagements, and the jagged scars were a language of pain that required no translation. Kalen's breathing was now a series of wet, ragged hitches. His clipboard had fallen to the gravel, forgotten. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had mocked her, and saw them trembling with a sudden, uncontrollable rhythm. The professional pride he had worn like armor was now a heap of scrap metal at his feet. "The Black Pass," Sergeant Jacks whispered, the words barely audible over the rising mountain wind. He looked at Elara with a mixture of terror and profound terminal respect. He knew the rumors. He knew that in that valley the ghost hadn't just survived. She had stayed behind to ensure a dying unit wasn't desecrated. The paperwork she had been doing for the last 2 years wasn't administrative filler. It was the slow, agonizing process of documenting the fallen, a self-imposed penance for being the only one to walk out. But the atmosphere shifted from shame to immediate, visceral dread as Thorne's warning took hold. This wasn't a history lesson. It was a mobilization. Thorne turned to the horizon, his jaw set like a block of granite. "They've been tracking the digital signature of the Shadow Cadre's archives. Every time you accessed those files to finish your reports, Elara, you left a breadcrumb. They didn't think you existed. Now they're coming to make sure you don't." The sensory details of the range began to sharpen into a tactical reality. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of distant rotors began to vibrate in the chests of the men, a sound that wasn't on the morning's flight schedule. It was a low, aggressive frequency, the sound of hunters closing a perimeter. The smell of ozone and wet earth intensified as a storm front began to roll over the iron peaks, plunging the range into a ghostly, green-tinted shadow. "What do you do when the ghost of your past isn't a memory, but an incoming strike team?" Elara didn't panic. She didn't ask for cover. She turned back to the rifle on the bench. Her movements were no longer fluid. They were predatory. She checked the chamber, the metallic snick of the bolt sounding like a death knell in the sudden quiet. She reached into her kit and pulled out a small, worn notebook, the real dope chart. "Master Sergeant," she said, her voice cutting through Kalen's paralysis. He snapped his head toward her, his eyes wide and vacant. "Stop staring at the ink. If you want to keep your men alive, you'll get them into the tree line. Now." It was the first time she had given an order, and the authority behind it was absolute. Kalen didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He began barking orders, his voice cracking with the strain of transitioning from a bully to a leader under fire. The soldiers scrambled, the sound of boots on gravel replaced by the frantic metallic clatter of gear being readied. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the cold metallic taste of adrenaline. Thorne stood by Elara as she settled back into the prone position. The wind was screaming now, tearing at the range flags until they shredded. "You don't have to do this, Captain. We have a QRF 5 minutes out." "5 minutes is a lifetime in a valley like this, sir," Elara replied, her eye glued to the optic. Her finger hovered over the trigger, feeling the vibration of the nearing helicopters through the chassis of the rifle. "They aren't coming for the unit. They're coming for the witness. If I move, they'll level this entire ridge to find me. Imagine the moral calculus of that decision. To stay and become a lightning rod, or to run and risk the lives of the men who just spent the morning spitting on your name. What would you choose?" The first blacked-out transport cleared the ridgeline, a shadow against the darkening clouds. It didn't have markings. It didn't have a transponder. It had a door gunner already swinging a heavy barrel toward the range. Elara's world narrowed. The wind, the shame of the men, the general's presence. It all vanished. There was only the lead edge of the rotor hub and the 2-second delay of the bullet's flight. She didn't fire at the gunner. She didn't fire at the pilot. She aimed for the one piece of the machine that shouldn't be visible, the exposed fuel pressure regulator of an unauthorized modification. The shot broke. The sound was swallowed by the roar of the mountain storm. A second later, the helicopter didn't explode. It simply lost its heartbeat. The engine coughed a plume of black smoke. The rotors slowed to a sickening terminal whine, and the craft began a jagged, uncontrolled descent into the pines. Jax watched from the tree line, his breath hitching in his throat. He realized then that Elara wasn't trying to kill. She was trying to disable. She was still fighting the war of a guardian, protecting even the ground she stood on. But as the first bird went down, 2 more rose over the southern crest, their nose-mounted cameras swiveling toward the firing line. A red laser dot appeared on the gravel, inches from Elara's boot, dancing with a lethal, rhythmic persistence. Thorn grabbed her shoulder, his grip tightening as he saw the spotters. "Elara, we have to go! They've locked the position!" Elara didn't move. She chambered another round, her face a mask of iron and old scars. She looked at the general, and for the first time, he saw the internal stake, the absolute exhaustion of a woman who had been running for 3 years and was finally done. "General," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the screaming rotors, "tell the men to keep their heads down. I'm not leaving until the ledger is balanced." Just as she prepared the next shot, a high-pitched electronic chirp erupted from her own admin radio, the one she used for logistics. A voice came through, distorted by encryption, cold and familiar. "Ghost 1, this is the valley side. We didn't come for the general. We came for the scorecard. Hand over the arm, or we burn the ridge." Elara's hand froze on the bolt. She looked down at the tattoo on her wrist, the broken arrow. "They aren't here to kill me, General," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. "They're here to take the evidence, and they just took the transport carrying the trainees as leverage." The scream of the wind through the pines was suddenly eclipsed by the static, choked threat on the radio. At Black Ridge, the atmosphere didn't just feel hostile, it felt terminal. The air was thick with the scent of unburnt kerosene and the electric charge of an approaching storm. Think about the moment your past finally catches up to you, not as a memory, but as a physical threat to innocent people standing right next to you. How do you weigh the value of your own anonymity against the lives of trainees who, only minutes ago, were laughing at your expense? Elara's hand, previously like stone on the rifle, tightened until the tendons in her forearms stood out like bridge cables. She looked toward the southern valley, where a transport truck, filled with younger soldiers, sat stalled on the narrow access road, pinned down by the hovering shadows of the unidentified helicopters. The mockery that had defined the morning was gone, replaced by a raw, naked terror that radiated from the men in the tree line. They weren't soldiers in that moment. They were targets. "Master Sergeant," Elara's voice was a low, jagged rasp that cut through the thunder. Kalen looked at her, his face a mask of ash and sweat. The arrogance had been burned away, leaving only a man who realized he was out of his depth. "The valley side. They don't want a firefight. They want the data on my arm. They want the names of the people I protected at the Black Pass." Kalen's gaze drifted to the intricate ink on her skin, the permanent record of ghosts. He finally understood. She wasn't an administrator. She was a living, breathing archive of things that were never supposed to happen. General Thorne stepped forward, his boots crunching heavily on the frozen gravel. He looked at the helicopters, then at Elara. The moral weight of the situation was a physical pressure in the air. "If you give them that data, Elara, the people you saved 3 years ago, they're dead men walking. If you don't, those trainees on the road don't make it to sunset. What would you do? Is the lives of the few worth the secrets that protect the many? It's the kind of choice that leaves a mark deeper than any tattoo." Elara didn't answer with words. She reached for the heavy-caliber rifle and did something that made Jax's heart skip a beat. She didn't point it at the helicopters. She pointed it at the fuel tank relay of the range's own generator shack. Crack. The shot was precise, surgical. The generator erupted, not in a ball of fire, but in a shower of sparks and a thick, oily plume of white smoke that began to billow across the range, caught by the mountain wind. Within seconds, a wall of artificial fog began to mask the firing line, obscuring the ghost from the thermal optics of the birds above. "Jax!" Elara barked. The sergeant snapped to attention, his pulse visible in the hollow of his throat. "Move the trainees under the cover of the smoke. Kalen, get your men to the high ground. Do not fire unless they breach the perimeter. This isn't your war." "And you?" Kalen asked, his voice trembling. Elara looked at the ink on her arm, the scorecard of a life spent in the shadows. "I'm going to finish the report." As the smoke engulfed the range, the sound of the world changed. The roar of the helicopters became muffled, a rhythmic thumping in the chest that felt like a failing heart. Elara moved through the fog with the silence of a predator in its natural habitat. She wasn't running, she was positioning. She reached a jagged outcrop of granite that overlooked the access road. The metallic taste of adrenaline was sharp on her tongue. Through her optic, she saw the door gunners on the lead helicopter. They were searching the smoke, their movements frantic, frustrated by the sudden loss of their target. She had them in her sights. One squeeze, and the threat to the trainees would be neutralized. But the scorecard on her arm wouldn't be settled. To kill them was to start a war. To let them go was to remain a ghost. A quiet, reverent silence fell over the men watching from the tree line as they realized what was happening. They weren't watching a qualification anymore. They were watching a sacrifice. Elara Vance was choosing to reveal herself completely, to lead the hunters away from the unit and back into the void she had spent 3 years trying to escape. Jax watched her silhouette vanish into the white haze, a lone figure heading toward the ridgeline, away from safety. He realized then that true strength doesn't need a microphone or a rank. It only needs the resolve to stand in the gap when everyone else is falling back. The helicopters pivoted, their sensors finally catching a heat signature moving rapidly toward the higher peaks. They followed, their rotors screaming as they banked away from the trainees, lured by the promise of the data they craved. The range went quiet, save for the dying hiss of the generator. Thorn stood alone on the gravel, his eyes fixed on the empty ridge. Kalen walked up beside him, his head bowed, the weight of his own shame finally breaking his posture. "Will she come back?" Kalen asked, his voice a whisper. Thorn looked at the master sergeant, his expression grave and unreadable. "Captain Vance died 3 years ago at the Black Pass, Kalen. Today, you just saw her ghost finally decide to stop haunting us and start hunting them." The general turned and walked toward the admin building, but he stopped at the door. He looked at the bench where Elara had left her small, worn notebook, the real dope chart. "The problem is," Thorn said, looking back at the stunned soldiers, "she didn't take the notebook. She left the names of the survivors with us, which means she isn't planning on being captured. And she isn't planning on coming back." As the first snowflakes of the storm began to fall, a single, distant gunshot echoed from the high peaks. Not a hit, but a signal. The story of the ghost of Black Ridge was over, but the war for the scorecard had just begun.